Hi everyone, my name's Penny Modra and I'm thrilled to be here at the Wheeler Centre tonight introducing one of my heroes, Lawrence Weschler. His publisher, McSweeney, uses the phrase Weschlerian as an adjective to describe a way of thinking. He's been a staff writer for The New Yorker for more than 20 years, covering political tragedies and cultural comedies, they say. Among many prizes, Lawrence has been shortlisted for the Pulitzer for his work, Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Wonder, which I think many of you might remember being referenced in the recent Wheeler Centre talk by Tavi Jevinson. I'm getting some nods. Or you may have met the book before then. Beginning in 1999, Lawrence's series of essays, Convergences, started to be published in the McSweeney's Quarterly from issue 4 onwards. And ultimately that became a book, Everything That Rises, a book of convergences, which is here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's actually an actual book, which is very difficult to get in Melbourne now, unfortunately, so get on eBay. When this launched, McSweeney's launched a competition. What was it? I guess it was
a contest.
A contest online, and you can still visit the archive of all the entries. But it's really not for me to introduce Lawrence or his ideas about convergences, because that's what he's going to do today. He's going to take us through, his idea of a typology of convergences. And if you guys start to panic and think you should be taking notes, there is actually a summary at the back for you if you want to grab one on your way out. Lawrence is going to go through his talk and we are going to try to have the most amount of audience questions possible, so please think and be ready, and we will speed our way through it at the end. Anyway, thank you everyone and welcome Lawrence.
Thank you. We don't have time for that. Okay, so ordinarily I was explaining to them that this is like an hour and 15-minute talk, which I'm now going to do a 30-minute compress of. But indeed, after I graduated from college, a family friend was a shrink and gave me a battery of tests to figure out what I should do with my life. 800 question personality inventory and so forth in the Rorschach, and it came back a week later. And oops, I went too far. Let's go back. And when I came back, he said that we do an inventory on the Rorschach. There's all kinds of things. We look at sexuality and aggression and so forth. And one of the things is general free associating tendencies. And you are so far off the chart, no one has ever seen a score like this. And he said, this is not going to be good for you in your life. And indeed, the first book I ever did was an attempt to get away from that. My ongoing relationship with Robert Irwin, the artist, consists of he and I going and looking at things, and I started having all these free associations, and he says, can't you just shut the fuck up? That he has trained himself over the years to not have free associations, and there is something to be said for not having free associations. And indeed the title of the book, Seeing is Forgetting the Name of the Thing One Sees. What would it be like to forget everything and just see it, But unfortunately, I'm not that person, and so indeed, as has been described, actually, I did a series of convergences. And I'll just give you very quickly the kind of thing that shows up in the book. For example, that is Jackson Pollock on the right, 1952, and Time Life Books on the Galaxies, 1952. And what's interesting about that is that when Jackson Pollock first started showing those paintings, over and over again, people used that language. They would use, it's galactic, it's nebulae. One of my favorite things that they would say is, they're so silent. Yeah, I mean, they're paintings, of course they're silent. But the point was that it's like the silence of outer space. Explosions in a vacuum and so forth. So I pointed that out, but then I went on to talk about Rothko, who, is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful painter. And one of the standard biographical points about Rothko is that the work gets darker and darker and darker and darker, and then finally you're faced with these paintings, the last group of paintings he does, like the ones on the right, in 1969, and then he commits suicide. And, that's just the standard anytime you go to a Rothko show, that's how the show is laid out. But I found myself suddenly realizing, standing in front of one of those paintings, one of the last paintings, that what was going on in 1969, that was the moment of the moon landing. And the imagery is incredibly close. And I'm not in any way being reductionist here. I don't want to say that Rothko got his final imagery from television, but rather what would the moon landing have felt like to somebody like Rothko? After all this incredible, astonishing thing, and you get there and there's nothing there. And the metaphysical emptiness, I think, is saturated with that. I'm the kind of guy who, when he sees a book like this, a picture like this in a book of Chilean photographs, thinks of that. But it's worse than that, because I'm also the kind of guy who, when he thinks of that, thinks of that. The Rokeby Venus. Let me get this here. Oh, see, I'm blowing it. Okay, that's the Rokeby Venus. But look, particularly over here. I mean, you have this kind of smile, and I'm convinced that Man Ray was playing off of that. Up in this little corner up there. But then I began to think I must be crazy, except that a few years later, Man Ray took that photograph. And what's really weird is that painting was done in 1933 in Paris, and in 1933 in Paris, a few blocks away, Chagall did this painting at the same time. I don't know what this means. It just happens, you know. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are in the book. Long story, don't have time. Anyway, so the point is that we published the book, that we had the Convergence Contest, and the Convergence Contest began having all sorts of things were being submitted by people, and so, for example, we got this sort of thing. And what's really weird is the minute that it turned out there was just like there was a plague of these politicians eating children. Wait. So why is it? It's moving by itself. Make it stop moving. Okay. Stay there. And then just another one here. Stay. This is veiled people on carousels. On the left side you have in the West Bank, and on the right side you have Ku Klux Klan people on an outing in Iowa in 1926. This next one is really fantastic, actually. This is a one photograph, one image convergence. What you see there is clear cutting a forest in Sweden as seen from the air. And it's kind of fascinating if you think about it, because what's happening is they don't want people on the roads to see what's going on, but once they get in there, they want to be as efficient as possible. There's all sorts of Christological ones. A woman who's just finished swimming the English Channel was compared to Christ, except Christ didn't have to deal with the paparazzi. I got countless people putting up clotheslines and thinking that they were doing Iwo Jima. But the interesting thing about Iwo Jima, in turn, is the reason that we are so attracted. I did not. You saw my hand. It was like that. Okay, let's. Jesus. The reason Iwo Jima. I'm trying to figure, is there a slideshow thing that's going on here? I don't know. Anyway, the reason Iwo Jima was remembered out of all the photographs that were taken that day was because everybody had that association to the raising of the cross. Anyway, the whole point of this is that eventually somebody sent in this thing here, and more specifically this here, that this painting by Eric Fischl on the bottom, this person was convinced was based on Uccello's St. George and the Dragon. And this was the last straw for me. I said, I don't know what's going on here. But he pointed out rather interestingly, I mean, there is some really weird stuff going on here. This horse-like construction here, this dragon man with his outstretched wings in a certain sense, the lady here, even the parquet floor. It just feels very strange. And Eric Fischl, and when I got that, I said, okay, we've got to sit down and figure out what's going on when you have these sorts of things happening. So the rest of this talk, and I'm going to go very fast, but is trying to figure out what goes on when things rhyme like that visually. And I'm going to start at one extreme and go to the other extreme. So we're going to start at apophenia, one of my favorite words, and if you get nothing else out of this, think of this kind of like a butterfly collection. I'm a Victorian gentleman, and I'm showing you the different drawers with the different kinds of things. So the first drawer we have is apophenia, and I didn't do that, but anyway, if you get nothing else out of this talk, remember apophenia. Apophenia is the tendency of human beings to see patterns where there are no patterns. Is that a great word? So, for example, in Godard's Two or Three Things I Know About Her, there's this wonderful scene where the title character is in a coffee shop, and she looks into the coffee cup, and suddenly there's this whole universe, if you're at a theater, of coffee, and the sediment is swirling around, and you can't help but think of galaxies. And then at one point there's this little section where it's just bubbling, and it absolutely looks like cells, and they divide up, and you just absolutely cannot help but have those associations. And that's because human beings are apopheniacs. We just see things like that, even when it has nothing to do with that, but we see it. Now, one version of that, of course, is projection, which is the stuff you get in Rorschach tests. Very good joke here, no time. But I got the laugh anyway, so that's good. I like this Rorschach thing, actually. Now, when you get to the extreme version of projection, you begin to enter the land of paranoia, where, for example, in that film 23, Jim Carrey suddenly is convinced that everything adds up to 23, which is parenthetically not that hard. Any set of numbers you can turn into 23 through one operation or another. This is the 23rd slide, I just noticed. When you get into political paranoia, you get some great things. The guy on the left, on the right here, is saying, God and Obama, neither of them has a birth certificate. And this is a German edition, a Spanish edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it basically proves that the Jews are responsible not only for capitalism, masonry, communism, Christianity, but also Nazism. They've got it figured out there. Okay, so that's apophenia. That's where things are just, humans have a tendency to that sort of thing. The next kind of thing you see is accident or chance. And that's the chance, and the shuffle of things is one subcategory there, which explains why one day in The Economist, the guy in this ad walked out of the ad and went into that picture there. I mean, that's just like... or another time, which is really amazing, that was the back cover of The Economist the week before 9/11. Somebody at that advertising agency had a bad week. But then you get the phenomenon of separated at birth. There's whole books devoted to this in the United States anyway, where it turns out that Mick Jagger and Don Knotts look exactly the same. But then you also get this sort of thing. And then you get the really weird one, which is Charlie Watts looks exactly like Buster Keaton, who in turn looks exactly like Samuel Beckett. And in fact, Beckett used Keaton in some short films he made, but that doesn't explain why they all look exactly like Wittgenstein, except that Wittgenstein's favorite films were Buster Keaton films. Now here's one in the United States that people like a lot, but you may or may not get this. This is during the Bosnian War. I suddenly noticed that Newt Gingrich, who was our political madman, looked exactly like Milosevic, the head of the Bosnian Serbs. And I refer to them both as Pillsbury Doughboy Messiahs. Was that an advertising campaign here? And now you get to the point where they even, it shows up on TV like this. But the thing that's amazing, now this is an American thing, and I invite you to use it here as well if you could figure it out. But in America, there's this whole plague of Pillsbury Doughboy Messiahs. We have Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck. All these guys are right-wing nuts. Karl Rove, Dick Morris, Antonin Scalia. The godfather of the Pillsbury Doughboys is Roger Ailes, who's the head of Fox News. and he has all these kind of bimbettes as his anchor people, and anyway, you get the idea. Anyway, and it turns out that there's a Pillsbury Doughboy Messiah thing going through history. And that, anyway, the end of this whole sequence, if you're in the United States, is I say that I called my friend John Hodgman to ask him what he made of this, and he didn't know what I was talking about. Anyway, so you get. We're still in the accident or coincidence. You have separated at birth. You also have transubstantiated in death, and that's the sort of thing where stains look like the Madonna. The Madonna shows up on toast. She shows up in, this one on the this one over here is an Australian thing that happened. There was a huge thing about a tree somewhere way in the desert that suddenly was Christ at a certain time every day, and that lasted until the fall came, and then it wasn't there anymore. But the Shroud of Turin, but it also goes across religions. During the Intifada, there was a sheep born on the West Bank that had the word Allah written on its side. And it's not only religion, by the way. You also have the phenomenon of jelly beans that look just like Kate Middleton. And a year after John Paul II died, there was a bonfire. There was a whole campaign to have him turned into a saint, beatified. There was a big event in Krakow, his hometown, where there was a bonfire. A guy was taking pictures of the bonfire, got home and noticed this. And this was presented as, if you think about this, by the way, nobody saw this. Right? I mean, it was just a photograph that would show up. But this was submitted as evidence, further evidence that he... Now, at the same time, in Warsaw, there was a show of Maurizio Cattelan, which included his famous Pope hit by meteor sculpture. And that was shut down for being sacrilegious. Pope on fire, proof of sainthood, Pope hit by meteor, wrong. Anyway, but again, just a few others. You had the phenomenon of solar flares that look just like Sasquatch. I got a lot more of these. We're going to go right past them, and now we're going to go to affinities. So now up to now we've had projection, apophenia, all that stuff. We've had just coincidence, but now we're beginning to get to something more interesting, more. Not as significant, I guess. So this is the category where you have the things like the fact that Cubists were very attracted to primitive art, quote unquote, African art, all kinds of historically interesting reasons, all kinds of controversy, political correctness, whether you're allowed to talk about this. But the point is that there's no doubt that Picasso goes to the Musée de l'Homme in Paris and sees these African masks, which at one level are the result of French imperialism and French colonialism, all showing up there. But he's attracted, Max Ernst is attracted to similar sorts of imagery. And one way of thinking about it, independent of what that affinity might be, is that these artists who at that point in history are trying to break out of the straitjacket of one-point perspective go to places where there isn't one-point perspective. So they're drawn to Japanese art, Chinese art, and in this case, primitive art. On the far side of the history of colonialism, you get the blowback from this problem, which is African artists who take Western detritus and turn them into primitive masks. This is a guy, a man from Benin. I forgot his name, but he takes gas canisters and earphones and so forth, and does his versions of primitivism, quote unquote. Now we move on to co-causation. This is going to be a whole section, but co-causation is what happens when things look alike because they draw on the same sources. So, for example, when you had that horrible picture from Abu Ghraib of the guy who was being tortured, having to stand on a plinth and hold out his hands. It looked exactly like the monument to the missing of the Somme. But that in turn is because of Christian imagery. And what's strange about what was happening in Abu Ghraib is that these people who were fairly unlettered, they aren't at all artists or anything, are kind of mixing up two Christian images. They have him as crucifix, but they also had wound wire around his finger and were laughing at the fact that he was freaking out that he was going to be electrocuted. Now, he wasn't, in fact, it wasn't hooked up. But so it's a combination of the mocking of Christ and the thing, but that's why you get, it seems like a completely weird coincidence that this is happening, but they in fact share the same source. Similarly, in nature, across all sorts of different phyla, birds, bats, butterflies, independently you will get flying invented as something, because there are various reasons why this amount of mass of material has to get from here to here, and that's one of the strategies for doing it. It also turns out, by the way, I had said to you before that this is Apophenia, about the coffee cup, but there's a book by a wonderful physicist named Sidney Perkowitz called Universal Foam, From Cappuccino to the Cosmos. And it turns out that the laws that govern the cosmos are exactly the same laws that cover what's going on in a bowl of cappuccino. So in fact, that's not as big a coincidence as you might think. A subset of this is fractalization. Fractalization is the thing that makes all the sides of a snowflake uncannily similar. It's the thing that means that if you take a microscopic photograph of two pebbles of sand, it will look uncannily like one of the moons of Mars. You can use this to create artificial landscapes. You get fractal landscapes made out of algorithmic finance. What you'll see here, this is Benoit Mandelbrot, who kind of invents this whole part of mathematics. But eventually, you can just do what seems to be chaos, but they generate. Both of those are not photographs; those are entirely artificially generated landscapes based on a very simple formula. What's interesting, though, is that you see this happening over and over again. So, for example, you often think of mountain ranges when you see what happens with the stock market. And indeed, there's a German artist named Michael, I'm blanking, Nyman, I believe, or something like that. But anyway, he is a mountain climber, and he takes the photographs he does of mountains, and he photoshops them so that, for example, in this case, it's following the Dow Jones averages over a 10-year period. This is the Nikkei averages over a 5-year period. And my single favorite of his creations is Lehman Brothers over a period of 3 months. But what's weird about that is that the whole thing about art and money goes way, way back. And in fact, you had all the way back, I mean, the Medicis were bankers before they were collectors. And indeed, they liked to collect paintings. Cosimo Medici collected this particular painting, which is the diamond mines. And that same kind of thing happens in the background and is making reference, likewise, to what's happening with diamond prices. Another example of things being caused by the same thing is branching structures. So, for example, does anybody know what that is? Let's have some shout-outs of guesses what this might be.
Supermoto?
No, but clever, Mr. Crooks.
Feather?
A feather's a good idea, yeah. Or some people say algae. Some people will say brain tissue. Weather system would be good. What in fact it is if you take a piece of lucite, a block of lucite, to your nearest linear accelerator, you can look them up in the yellow pages, and you zap it with many gigabytes of electricity, you will take it out and it will be super saturated with stray electrons, which is to say there is literally not room for one more stray electron, and they are dying to get out. And they can't because it's an insulator. It's a very good insulator. And if you drag your hand across the face of it, you get a lot of static electricity. But it's kind of yellowish. But then if you turn it upside down and you take a nail and you hammer that in, you'll get a flash of electricity as the literally infinite number of stray electrons self-organize instantaneously into that pattern. And because it's plastic, you can see them do it. And if you like this, you go to a place called teslamania.com, and it costs like $25. They sell it to you. It's really cool. But the point is, the point is that indeed the reason we see this pattern over and over again, for example in brain cells and so, is that over and over again it's electrical energy moving in different sorts of ways through the universe. So indeed it does look like deltas, it looks like trees, it looks like brain cells, it looks like leaves. This kind of pattern happens over and over again. And certainly in the case of brain, that's electrical systems are wiring, the brain is wiring itself over time and so forth. Now the thing that's an interesting question you can ask at that point is it because our brains look like that middle image that we constantly think in terms of decision trees, genealogical trees? The one here is Ad Reinhardt's genealogical tree of modernism. It's Picasso, Matisse, and Braque, and then it has all those leaves. Over here, there's a wonderful artist named Beth Campbell, who I urge you to invite here to Australia if you haven't had her. She will come to your gallery. She'll find an empty wall, and she'll whatever's bothering her at that point, she'll do a decision tree about. This is her to try to decide whether to be a lesbian or not. I'm just reporting this fact. Another reason things look the same because they're co-causation is because they are in fact the same thing, which is why it happens that historically ideas, the world of ideas becomes supersaturated with an idea on the imminent brink of happening, which is why you'll get both Leibniz and Newton stumbling on the calculus simultaneously. There's not room for one more idea in the culture without that happening, and it happens two places simultaneously. The same thing, by the way, with evolution itself, where you had Darwin and Wallace simultaneously coming up with the idea, and the idea was about trees, about the tree of life, about branching structures. Another sort of thing about why things might look alike is because they are in fact the same thing. One of my favorites of these are floaters. You know when you go outside and and it's a nice day and you put some grass in your mouth and you're looking up the sky and those things are kind of floating, you know, and they start to float away and you kind of move them back up and they look kind of like microscopic cells, you know, and they're really interesting. You kind of watch, oh, that's interesting. They are microscopic cells. They are in fact they're called floaters, and they are dead tissue inside your eyeball. But they're just little strands of cells. But you are seen microscopically without any equipment because of the optics of the eye, which is why when Leeuwenhoek first starts looking through the microscope and seeing things, he says, you know, when you go outside and you take a big grass and you look up, it looks just like that. And it's because that's what it was in fact. Similarly, you have the story, a very strange story, of Percival Lovell, who was this billionaire in America in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who was very into astronomy, and he indeed, there are many Lowell telescopes all over the world, and he would look, and the reason that there is because he would look through a telescope and look at Mars and see canals and channels on Mars. And that in the middle one there is one of his drawings of the channels. Now what was happening, and sometimes if you've ever looked at it through a telescope, you've had this experience where you suddenly see the inside of your eye. Because in fact the telescope, the optics turn into an ophthalmoscope briefly. And that, by the way, when you go have a physical and the doctor looks at with a flashlight in your eye, he's not at all interested in your vision. It happens that back there is one of the places where blood vessels run closest to the surface, and you can actually look at them. And if they are really pronounced, that means that you're more likely to have a stroke than you might otherwise have, which is why he's looking back there. The kind of stroke that Percival Lovell died of at the age of 60, because his were unusually pronounced. Trust me, this is really funny, but I don't have time. This is funny, by the way. This is there in Brooklyn. There is a kind of upper class, or rather a kind of a hipster McDonald's, which has cool art on the walls. And I was really amazed because it looks exactly like Rothko's on their side, because they are Rothko's on their side. Anyway. Similarly, you've got the problem of zeitgeist, which is, you know, why is there suddenly vampire movies everywhere and so forth? One of the things that's interesting about zeitgeist, I could go on length at why that happens, but it almost always happens in vanilla and in mild and spicy versions. when it happens. So that, for example, when you get the Beatles, you can be sure you're going to get the Rolling Stones. When you get Michael Jackson, you get Prince. When you get Madonna, you get Cyndi Lauper. This happens politically as well. When you get Martin Luther King, you get Malcolm X. This thing happens over and over again, that it's ripe for this, and you get kind of different splintering of versions. Similarly, a few years ago, there was this extraordinary thing that happened, that two films were being made simultaneously, and they clearly did not know about each other, but when they came out, they had exactly the same main image, which was Melancholia and Another Earth, were both films in which suddenly a planet reared up close to the Earth, and at night, you could see it right up there, like a second Earth or a second moon, a second planet. In both cases, the women characters who were the lead characters were extremely depressed, and this was a kind of image of their depression. In both films, you had images of them looking up, astonished at the thing. But the really weird thing is that two sets of films completely independently assume that if this is ever going to happen, depressed women will go out and lie naked, looking up at and at the same angle. And I'm assuming that has to do with Diana, the moon goddess and so forth, but who knows. Okay, now another example of co-causation, we're down the line here, is cross metaphors. So that you just know that when the Costa Concordia sinks, every political cartoonist in the world simultaneously is going to do the same cartoon about the political situation or about the economic situation. This happens all the time, that you'll have the same cartoon happen over and over again. A version of that is what we call meme, and I could talk to you for hours about meme, and you're lucky that Dawkins isn't here because he would. But this is where the minute something like this happens, the pepper spray guy at Occupy Wall Street, 3 separate people did this. The pepper spray guy going through the history of art. He just shows up everywhere. Suddenly he's a meme. He's just the pepper spray guy. So. Anyway, okay, so now we're going to leave things having the same kind of origin, the same cause, and now we're going to move into, this is more into the world of art, or the world of making, and I'm going to talk to you about influence. And for starters, we have direct influence, where it's absolutely clear-cut. And that has 2 categories, backwards and forwards. So for example, everybody knows that Virgil, when Dante goes to the underworld, he goes with Virgil. And he's writing an epic poem, and the Aeneid has a huge influence. Virgil has a huge influence on Dante. He is quite overt about it. But T.S. Eliot points out that it's equally the case that Dante has a huge influence retrospectively on the Aeneid. It's impossible for us to read the Aeneid anymore without seeing it through Dante's eyes. So it's backwards and forwards. A more curious version of that is this, that when Christ has his hour of doubt in the garden, he prays to the Lord that the Lord let this cup pass him by, which is really weird because there is no cup in the story. What is clearly being referred to as a cup of hemlock, and that is the cup that Socrates takes. Now, one of the things that's fascinating there, if you read the last days of Plato's versions of the last days of Socrates, the Crito, the Euphyra, the Apology, and so forth, it's the same story, where supposedly he could have gotten away. There's a vote. Do you want him killed? Yes, let's kill him. He doesn't. He chooses not to get away, and so forth. Now, there's all kinds of things that are strange about that. But let's take at least 2 ways of looking at it. One of them is, of all of the wonder religions that were going on at that time in the year 0, and what basically, as Eliot points out, in Hellenistic times, you have this phenomenon of all these local religions starting to smear up against each other because there's lots of commerce going on. And so, whereas it was perfectly fine to have the local pagan god here and the local pagan god here and so forth, suddenly you have cults around them and they insist on being bigger than they were, and they start bumping up against each other. And where they really bump up against each other is where Europe, Asia, and Africa intersect, which is Palestine. And you had incredible centers, including John the Baptist. You had all these messianic cults going on. Why is it that the Christian one is the one that takes hold? Is it possible that especially among intellectuals in the year 100, 200, 300, going up through St. Augustine, that they already knew the story from Plato and Socrates and so forth, and were conditioned for the story so that when it arrives, it is the one out of all the other ones that is the one. There isn't a John the Baptist version in Greek mythology, but there is a Christian one. The flip side of that is that there were all kinds of fantastic philosophers in Athens in the 5th century BC. I mean, it wasn't just Socrates and Plato, but there's a whole range of them. But why is it Plato and Socrates who take over? And is it because during the Middle Ages, the ones whose manuscripts get copied over and over again are the ones who seem to fit the Christian story? I mean, it goes both ways. Or maybe they're just both true, and that's how it is. I don't know. So I mentioned forward, backward. There's also conscious, unconscious. It is Kurt Vonnegut looks exactly like Mark Twain because he is consciously trying to emulate Mark Twain. I could have had Richard Brautigan's another one who's a Mark Twain person, and so you get that phenomenon. And then it takes the form of apprenticeship, for example, where there was a whole show at the Getty about Rembrandt and his pupils. And there are people whose entire life consists of trying to look at drawings from the school of Rembrandt, which literally was a school, and they're using exactly the same models and trying to figure out which ones are Rembrandts and which ones are the pupils, and if they are the pupils, which pupils they are. And this is because of apprenticeship. That's how it was done. And the reason the apprentices look a lot like that is because they were apprentices. And this is a really good story, but I don't have time for that story. Anyway, okay. Then the second kind of thing you get in this regard is template. And I'm not going to show you the video unless you ask me afterwards, but it'll be on your time and not my time. But the incredible thing about Disney productions is that over and over again, the Disney studios use exactly the same template. I have a full minute sequence from Jungle Book and from Winnie the Pooh that are exactly the same moves. The hands are moving the same way, going up a cliff, coming down a cliff, and so forth. Snow White shows up. There are scenes from Little Mermaid that are straight out of Snow White. I mean, literally straight out, because the template was done. They'd gone to the trouble of making it, and it worked, and so they would use it over and over again. Then you have the phenomenon of permission. When Bob Dylan famously suddenly goes electric, he is both giving permission to other socially conscious singers to go electric and to other electric musicians to have social conscience stuff in their stuff. It's a huge thing that gives permission, and you start seeing it everywhere, but it was in the form of a strong statement that clears the field for people to do similar sorts of things. Those are all fairly conscious. Then you get the unconscious ones. For example, the overriding cultural frame. And I always use as my touchstone this amazing essay by John Berger, who is my hero. And John Berger, one day, a few months after the killing of Ché Guevara, said, "We all know what this photograph is based on. The image as if hot-wired in the brains of the generals that taught them where to stand, that taught the photographer where to take the picture from. This is obviously based on Rembrandt's anatomy lesson." And I remember reading that, and I was in high school still, and I said, God, this guy does not read the newspaper the way I read the newspaper, but this is a really cool way to read the newspaper. We'll have more to say about this in a second. Another interesting kind of thing is guilty conscience, which is this sort of thing. Under Hitler, there was a whole campaign to get mothers to have more children, and so there was all kinds of propaganda art. And under Putin, there's a huge crisis in Russia that mothers are not having enough children, and so the word came down, let's do some posters to advertise it, and that poster showed up. I mean, is this irony? Is this subversive? Is this a poster maker who just says, I hate Putin and he's such a fascist and I'm going to make it look like this? Is it, with the internet, it's more likely, I need some imagery of mothers, what's a good imagery, and they use that, and so, but there's a kind of underlay of guilty conscience when things look kind of the same, that's going on. You then have the fascinating phenomenon of the anxiety of influence, where artists continually ape other artists but don't see it. Because so for example, it's obvious to me that the overriding person who Hockney is close to is Matisse. He will never mention the word Matisse. But when you look at Hockney's kind of the sensual pleasure in bourgeois ease and so forth, time and again you get these Hockneys that are so clearly versions of Matisse's who he never ever refers to. In the same way, I will talk to you about Freud until your eyes are crossed. I will never, ever talk to you about Jung, who, as far as I'm concerned, is of no interest at all. And what's interesting about, in both these cases, it's just too close. And in order to create a space for creativity, you just have to occlude it and not think about it. That's the anxiety of influence. Now we're moving from influence to illusion, and the illusion comes in all kinds of different ways. You get invocation. So that, for example, when Rembrandt painted the anatomy lesson, clearly he was invoking a whole history of Christian iconography of the deposition. This is a Mantegna painting. The feet are exactly the same in terms of the angle and so forth, the loincloth. I am convinced that because of the Ché going by way of the anatomy lesson to all that earlier iconography, that's the reason you get this. That if Ché had happened to look like this the day he died, it wouldn't have happened. I'm not talking about the politics, I'm just talking about how images prepare the way for other images. Does anybody know who this is, by the way? This is Ché Guevara, disguised as an Argentinian businessman in his passport photo that allows him to go to Bolivia. But it's a damn good thing he looked like it was bearded the day he died. Otherwise, you wouldn't have. I'm absolutely convinced of that. That this person in a picture would not have. It wouldn't have worked. And for that matter, you probably wouldn't even have the anatomy lesson kind of thing happen. This happens all over the history of art. There's, of course, the very famous one of Goya, who is in 1803 showing the Napoleonic soldiers shooting the defenders of Madrid. And then when Napoleon III, the kind of first time as tragedy, second time as farce emperor, sends Maximilian of Austria to be the head, his dictator, his person on the scene in Mexico, and there's an uprising, and Maximilian is killed. Manet uses exactly the same thing, invoking it. And what's fascinating is that the French-speaking and the Spanish-speaking are flipped. It's the French speakers killing the Spaniards in the first, and it's the Spanish speakers killing the French representative in the second. And by the way, both of them have Christian iconography going on in them. You know, this, but also the halo of the sombrero. Anyway, so that's where an artist will invoke another artist in their work. You then have the phenomenon of homage, and that's where, I mean, I told you a second ago that Hockney will never, ever talk about Matisse. He will never shut up on the subject of Picasso. He is constantly paying homage to Picasso here in a naked self-portrait as a young man with the great master. Over and over again, you'll have his paintings, his drawings that are consciously playing off of earlier drawings by Picasso. He even loves the fact that at the Picasso Museum, there's a whole big picture of Picasso smoking, and he poses himself next to Picasso smoking. Do not get David Hockney talking about smoking. Anyway, and in this context, this entire lecture is my homage to John Berger, who is my master. Now we're going to move pretty quickly here. We get the phenomenon of puns, such as the passion of the Spider-Man. Very consciously done by the filmmakers. They're punning, and in the same way, I don't have the referent here, but in MASH, there suddenly comes a scene where it's like the Last Supper, Then you get Pastiche. I'm going as fast as I can. And I shouldn't stop for this, but I'm going to stop for this. Pastiche is a really, really, really interesting thing when you see it. This was an ad that ran in the Prado's own magazine, in the back of the magazine for a department store. And you have a photographer clearly photographing into a mirror the scene. But what's fascinating about Pastiche almost always is it reveals something that you didn't understand about the original. In this instance, we all think, and there's endless writing, Foucault and everybody writing and so forth, that that there was this gathering of people, and Velázquez has this big painting that he's working on, and the one possibility is that it's the royal couple's point of view, and you see them, there's endless articles about this, but one possibility is that the royal couple is back there in a mirror, which means that they're actually standing here, that he's painting them, or maybe he's painting them and that's what's in the mirror, or there's all kinds of things going on, but the notion is that this actually happened. Whereas, of course, anybody before the invention of chemical photography in 1830 knew how to read a painting. This never happened. He spent a month working on that dog. Oh, stop it, how did that happen? I did not do that. Oh, let's get back here. Oh, now you're seeing all the good stuff. Oh, my God. He did them one at a time, and anybody it used to be that when you went to look at a big painting, it was like going to a movie. You thought about it. Oh, look, he worked on that for a while, then he worked on this. He was a director. He set up the whole thing. There was a whole costume shop. It was like a studio. David Hockney says that there were the two gay guys who were in charge of the hats. There was a whole studio system, and it was done over time, and you looked at it that way. And it's only because of snap photography or iPhones and so forth that we imagine there actually was a moment like this. Nobody in the old days would have looked at it that way. It's the same phenomenon you get here, where you have a David LaChapelle parody of a Dutch floral still life, and in his version, which is a photograph, you have iPhones. You also have the flowers at different stages of decomposition. So he had to have some flowers that had rotted and some that were fresh and so forth on the day that he did it put together. Of course, when you look at a bouquet like that, you think, God, he's so good at portraying a bouquet. Every single one of those flowers was done separately. They would have all rotted by the time they were done. So, it's interesting. Okay, enough of that. So we go from pastiche to parody, and now we get this phenomenon. This drove the Republicans crazy. It was really the case that George Bush did look exactly like Alfred E. Newman from Mad Magazine. Alfred E. Newman's famous slogan was, "What me worry," and the Nation magazine, the left-wing magazine, had a cover that said "worry," and this drove Republicans crazy. And when Obama was running, they in turn did a poster that says if the Nation were Republican, they would do this, but they won't because they're not. And then there was the famous pictures of Obama's face with hope, but they put hopeless. And then Mad Magazine, late to the party, got on the bandwagon, so that for the inauguration issue, they did their own version of the thing. Okay, now we're moving quickly. Quotation is what happens when it sounds alike because they're actually being quoted. So when Melville obviously had been steeped in the Bible and during the years before he wrote Moby Dick and in Shakespeare. And there are whole passages that are just lifted almost, that are conspicuously quoting. I don't have time to tell you about this one, but it's a good one, but never mind. Now you get to appropriation, where it's consciously appropriated. You get Andy Warhol. The reason this looks like a Campbell soup can is because he is in fact appropriating a Campbell soup can and declaring it art. It actually, what's fascinating when he did it was, and what people realized, is that this is a pop version of a Rothko. And that's what he was doing. And then he would make Brillo pad things and so forth. But of course, what he was also doing was he was appropriating the whole strategy from Marcel Duchamp, who famously, and one of the key moments in the history of art, is supposedly the way it's told to you is he takes a urinal, signs it, puts it on a plinth, and declares it art, and therefore it's art. That is in fact not at all what he did. He took a urinal put it on its side, and then made a claim about its artistic value. And in fact, when his friend Stieglitz did a photograph, he was really bringing out what he intended, that it is a holy object. It's like a Buddha or like a Pieta, and it has that kind of that art as there's all kinds of things going on. It's not a simple urinal. It is strange, by the way, that the Pieta was attacked by a hammer-wielding guy named Laszlo Toth in the early 60s. There was a great, I've been looking for it, I can't find it, in the Harvard Lampoon, of a picture of Laszlo Toth as he's about to hit the Pieta, and he says, "Oh my God, Pieta, I thought it said piñata." But what's really weird is that about 10 years ago, there was a guy named Ponticelli, the fountain, as it's called, the urinal, was on display in Nîmes, near Arles, and a man from Saint-Rémy, which is the place where Van Gogh was in the insane asylum, came to Nîmes and attacked the fountain with a hammer. And when he was put on trial, and this is the part I love, it turned out this was the second time he'd attacked it. And his defense was that he had attacked it 5 years earlier when the same piece was on display in the Pompidou Center in what is easily the single greatest act of performance art of the past 150 years. He urinated into it. And his defense in front of the judge was, after I urinated into it, it remembered its true function and was in a rictus of embarrassment, having been gawked at as art ever since, and he was trying to put it out of its misery. You know, there's any number of artists who do Sherry Levine does a version, Liza Liu does a version. Long story, we'll go past that. Okay. Now you get to cryptomnesia, which I don't have time to talk about at any length, except to tell you that it happens all the time, where great masters, and I'm talking about serious great writers, will rip off long swaths of other great writers and deny having done it, and absolutely adamantly say they didn't do it, and insist they didn't do it. And this happened with Brian Friel, whose play Molly Sweeney includes long paragraphs taken from Oliver Sacks. And he denied ever having read the Oliver Sacks. And this is a phenomenon called cryptomnesia, very useful for you to know in case you get in that trouble. Okay, now we're almost at the end here. We're at plagiarism. The reason things look alike is because somebody intends that they look alike. And you have forgery. The interesting thing about forgery is often, this is the famous Van Meegeren's forgeries of Vermeer. What's fascinating about forgeries is very often they date. Nobody could believe today that anybody ever thought this was a Vermeer, but I guarantee you this is exactly what Vermeer looked like in 1930. And if you want to know what Vermeer looked like in 1930, this is it. And they delaminate as time passes, often. Very interesting story about him, forget it, and then you get counterfeiture. And that's the reason things look alike, is because people are trying to pull one over on you. So we're almost at the end. There's a two-part coda. The first part is this, that Helen Keller in 1903 publishes The Story of My Life. Remember Helen Keller, blind, deaf and blind since birth. Publishes The Story of my life. 6 months later, she is accused of plagiarism. Let me repeat that. Helen Keller is accused of plagiarism. Now stop and think about it, because every experience Helen Keller ever had was mediated through language. When she stood in front of the Matterhorn, she was reading the Baedeker in Braille. She had incredible memory, or maybe somebody was reading it to her in sign language. And her experience of the Matterhorn, which she would describe in great detail in Story of My Life, was verbatim what happened. Anyway, she's thrown into a terrible, terrible depression. And Mark Twain, bless his soul, writes her one of the great letters of all time. "Oh, dear me," he writes her, "how unspeakably funny and owlishly idiotic and grotesque was that plagiarism farce. As if there was much of anything in any human utterance, oral or written, except plagiarism. The kernel, the soul, let us go further and say the substance, the bulk, the actual and valuable material of all human utterance is plagiarism. For substantially all ideas are secondhand, consciously or unconsciously drawn from a million outside sources and daily used by the garnerer with a pride and satisfaction born of the superstition that he originated them. Whereas, in fact, there's not a rag of originality about them anywhere except in the little discoloration they get from his mental and moral caliber and his temperament, which are revealed in characteristics of phrasing. Isn't that great? Anyway, so that brings us back so now where are we? And had we but whirled enough in time, I would invite you to all start shouting whether you think this is coincidence or apophenia or whatever, but we don't, so I'm going to cut to the chase, and then I'll get you back up here in a second. But wait, you can come up here. Okay, come up here. Okay, come up here quickly. But we may be dealing in apophenia, maybe coincidence. I tend to agree with the guy who sent it that there's more than that going on. The nice thing is that Fischl is around. You can ask him, which I in fact did. And Fischl absolutely claims that Uccello was not in his mind at all when he made this painting. But it really doesn't matter what he says. Because the artist, as Diderot says, the artist is merely the first witness of the completed painting. As such, there will be other witnesses, including the artist himself later on, bathed in the same cultural surround, who will have their own associations, and that it is all equally true, and that's the way culture works. And in fact, convergence ends up being another word for culture, for the history of cultural transmission. Or as a friend of mine commented the other day, quoting, she couldn't remember who she was quoting, she thought it might be Pound, culture begins when we forget our sources. Now, this is where I usually end it, except that I have something that just happened, which is if you go in this city, there is this amazing painting in the Aboriginal collection. Is it the Victoria?
NGV?
NGV
Australia, yeah.
And this is a huge painting done by 7 Aboriginal artists called the Dunka Warnglid. They are 7 women from the Bentink Islands who, at the Mornington Island Station in 2007, did a dreamscape, a songscape. And when I saw it, it just blew my mind because it looks exactly like David Hockney's Mulholland Drive. Huh. And what's weird about David Hockney's Mulholland Drive is that drive is a verb. It's about your eye goes for a drive. And it is also about moving through space. And the sky up above there is, in fact, a map of the San Fernando Valley. It's a very similar sort of thing. I've been talking to the people at the LA County Museum about how they should bring the paintings over and just have them stand side by side. There's also in the same museum, there's this painting by Long Tom, I'm sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, Jampanyaka, I think is his name. And this is his version of 2 holy spaces, Ayers Rock and so forth. But, of course, it's so much like Rothko. And the story goes that after he had been painting for some time, somebody showed him a book of Rothko's, and his answer was, yeah, that guy paints a lot like me. And what's interesting, though, what's really striking is that they are both deeply spiritual things, but entirely separate, because one of them is solid. It's a portrayal of solid space, and the other one are kind of cloud-like spaces. But anyway, enough. Sorry it took so long.
We still, thank you so much, Lawrence. We still do have time for questions. Okay. So I hope, do you guys have some questions? Yeah. Is someone nodding? I'm limiting myself here, so I've formulated
you can ask for a few at the beginning.
Well, I've made up a question that's 2 questions in one, so I try and be efficient.
And this gets you time to do.
If you have a question, do put your hand up, because the people will come around with microphones for you.
But you get to ask the first one.
I'll ask the first one. Okay, well, double barrel. I read something yesterday on the internet. I'm sure you about an experiment.
Which is the great incubator of convergence, by the way. It's really
so it's about an experiment, and I'm not exactly sure who performed it, but essentially it's an algae. It's a dish where they're cultivating algae. Algae, is that how you say?
Yeah.
And what the scientists have done is recreated a kind of terrain of the United States, and they placed tiny food sources at the major cities. Right. And they then allowed the algae to find the most efficient route between all the cities.
And that's a famous mathematical problem.
Is it really?
Which takes, for a computer to do it, you need a supercomputer to do it.
Yeah, right. So the algae did it. And then I was kind of shocked, having, probably just read this book again, but I was thinking, well, why aren't they linking to, like, the actual map of the main road routes between cities? So I guess that leads me to my double-barrel question. The first is, do you get sick of people coming up to you and telling you their convergences like that?
No, I mean
do a lot of people come
my
up to you?
argument is that is what culture is.
Yeah. But it's sort of like dreams. Do you ever think it's like people
I
going,
hate it when people come
night
and tell me their dreams. That I hate. Don't you hate that? And the reason, and there's actually an interesting reason, that is that the dream work has two different meanings. A dream work is both a work of art, and it's also the work of working stuff through. And for the person who has had the dream, they have the work of working it through. They're fascinated by it, but they're presenting to you as if it's a work of art. It's actually not a very good work of art. But it's
that's a nice way of thinking about it. I guess the second half of my question is, do you ever find I guess what I would describe that is maybe my urge to turn that into a convergence, or it's like, do you ever find something and then you think, well, I'm going to now wonder about this second thing. I'm going to look out for.
Well, it's interesting you said it. I was going to show something, and I'll just show it very quickly. Somebody sent me just the other day. This was not a setup. They sent me this picture of the Costa Concordia that was being raised, and they said, this is obviously an impressionist painting, but I can't remember which one. And we all went online looking for, and we can't find it. What you find are ones that are almost like it, and it is the fact that we mix them all in our brains into a kind of master one that other one had pieces of, but there isn't one that actually has that sort of thing. Although you're absolutely convinced it does, and so the answer is yes, and it's a huge sinkhole of time when somebody does that to you.
The obvious question, when I saw you talking, I was thinking, oh my gosh, what has search by image done to Lawrence? At what point did you discover Google search by image function, and what's it done to your life?
I try not to go too deep into that, but I do occasionally do it. It's dangerous. But anyway.
Who's got a question?
So, go ahead.
Oh, this lady.
I'm not sure if it's a question. It might just be maybe a comment that ran through my mind. When you were on causation and you were talking about zeitgeist and the popular culture examples you gave, I don't know if I'm being cynical, but to me I thought, isn't that more about marketing and push factors and pull factors? Well, that, we've got this globalised image coming more and more now.
I think, by the way, the comedy of money and art, or money or anything, is one of the great comedies in the world. Why things happen, they do, and so forth. But zeitgeist is a phrase that isn't just vampire movies. Zeitgeist is wide was perspective happening everywhere at a certain moment, and that has a little bit to do with supersaturation. That its moment had come, but there are things that happen all the time. There are whole trends in sociobiology. Suddenly happens everywhere. They're all coming up with evolutionary theories of sociology at a particular moment in history. That isn't marketed particularly, although that of course, once it's happening, marketers get on the bandwagon. But I think it's more than just that. But there's no question that marketers take advantage of it. Just one other way. Why is it that a marketer would know that a vampire film would work now when it wouldn't work some other time?
They've got people locked up in rooms doing months of research.
Well, but even there, why does the research reveal that for now, as opposed to some other time, vampires are big? There was a terrific thing recently about quicksand. that it used to be that every horror film had quicksand in it, and then that went away. And now they will not put, for example, they were interviewing the people who did the TV show Lost, and they said nobody would believe quicksand. Do you know the stuff that was on Lost? I mean, but that nobody would believe quicksand. Whereas in the 1960s, when you had Vietnam, when you had quagmire everywhere, quicksand was a thing, and that was zeitgeist, and that wasn't paid for, although then it later on is. But okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to say that the photograph, the picture that you had of the Concordia was exactly like a photograph. I think it's Henry Cartier-Bresson.
There is that one. That's right.
Yes.
I think you're right. I think you're right about that. Yeah. Which I'm sure. And by the way, I would make the argument that Henry Cartier-Bresson. That's good. Thank you so much, because we were stuck in paintings. So that's the answer. But the Henry Cartier-Bresson is consciously. Why did he click at that moment? And I would make the argument that his eye had been trained by these sorts of images to have that be a picture. We see pictures because of the history of other pictures we've seen, I think.
Who's next? We've still got some time.
Have you done any work on the kind of the enjoyment that we get, or the attraction of things that are forced convergence versus kismet? So I'm thinking like The Hero's Journey, that book that came out, then being applied to screenplays to make films that we might be appealing, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, that's a little bit of the Jung problem, where Joseph Campbell, who is the big, he's kind of patient zero of that whole problem, is read by George Lucas, and George Lucas gets all of his Carl Jung through Joseph Campbell and so forth, and you can, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there are, and that is the whole phenomenon of archetypes, and there are these basic stories that repeat over and over again, and in fact, there's some people say there's like 5 stories in total in the world, and everything's just a mixture of those stories, so yeah, I mean, this is part of that stuff, and that's why, by the way, there's all kinds of Christology going on in Star Wars. Luke, you are my father. I'm your father. All that kind of stuff is loaded with all kinds of primal imagery.
I want to ask a personal question. Well, someone else put your hand up, and I'll ask a personal question.
Yeah.
When Tavi spoke about reading Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Wonder at the Writers' Festival, she referred to an interview that she'd done herself with David Wilson, and a question that she asked him, I want to refer to. She asked, do you ever feel like there's a shortage of wonder in the world? Do you ever worry that you might be incapable of appreciating it? So I just wonder whether you ever have off days, or whether the opposite, as your psychologist said, that this free association is like this kind of thing that you have to rein in.
I was talking to you before. There's a maniac in the United States who sends out questionnaires getting everybody to write their 6-word autobiographies. He's gotten everybody to do it, and mine, I remember when I sent it in, was melancholy marvel at how everything coheres. But the melancholy, I mean, this is all, I think of myself mainly as a fairly melancholy person, actually, but this is the kind of spangle and glitter and so forth that is happening as part of that, or in counterpoint to it. In the case of David Wilson, I mean, well, David Wilson is a saint. I mean, that's as simple as that. But this is the guy who did the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles. That I wrote this book that she seemed to like a lot, it's the Museum of Jurassic Technology is a museum that is pitched. You go in there and you are just lost in a debauch of marvel, of wonder. And there's slippage everywhere, where you're wondering at the marvels of nature and wondering whether any of this is true. And you go back and forth between the two, and it's just this incredible place. And people think it's postmodern, question authority, and so forth. I would just give you one quick example of the museum, a very quick one. There's a vitrine that has a iridescent pebble and an iridescent beetle. And you pick up the telephone receiver, and then it has the voice of institutional authority. You know, that voice. And the voice says, "This beetle has learned to make exactly the same sound when threatened that this pebble makes at rest." The museum is just filled with this kind of stuff. And my favorite story about the book when it came out was that somebody went through the whole museum about 6 months later and then came up to David Wilson, to the guy at the front desk, and said, can you tell me, are you either David Wilson or Lawrence Weschler? And David said that he was David Wilson. The guy leaned over conspiratorially and said, "Come on, tell me the truth. Does that guy Lawrence Weschler really exist?"
Excellent. Who's next? Oh, you've got time for probably two more. Yeah.
I was just wondering, perhaps you could think that déjà vu was a kind of convergence.
Well, I mean, there is a whole phenomenon of déjà vu. Is another way I'd phrase it, though, is culture déjà vu. At the Museum of, there are some theories about déjà vu being a little time lapse, a hiccup, a chronological hiccup. There's all kinds of interesting theories about it. But the Museum of Drastic Technology has just installed some beautiful new exhibits. If you've been there but haven't been there in the last 5 years, you have to go back. It's just an amazing thing. There's a whole section of the museum that's given over to theories of memory, and he has all these kind of memory theorists who he probably made up. He has this one vitrine which has this crazy French memory theorist named Proust, who seems to think that if you look at cookies, you have all kinds of memories. And there's a picture of this cookie that he had supposedly wrote huge books out of. But then there's another vitrine that looks like an aviary. It's a beautifully rendered aviary, kind of very miniature and so forth, because Plato believed that memory was like an aviary with birds in it and so forth. But if you then go up to the second floor, they recently took an outdoor section upstairs and they reconverted it, and it's now an aviary, and it's the very aviary that you saw downstairs. And as you walk into it, you can't remember what it reminds you of, because it was just this little tiny thing.
So good.
It's really great.
Well, who's next? You can ask a curly one if you want to.
Or you can, if you have any left over.
I do.
Okay.
I'll ask a curly one. Oh gosh, which curly one though? I know. I'd like to hear, since it's Critics Week, Criticism Week at the Wheeler Centre, I feel as though I'd like to hear how this Weschlerian thinking affects your view of the critic's role. Is finding convergence a central or the true role of the critic?
It's nice when it happens, but it's not and by the way, I do other stuff besides this. I'm actually a reporter. I actually go to scary places, Bosnia, Iraq, things like that, and actually report. But even there, I have all kinds of convergences. So in a way, I don't think of myself as a critic. I think of myself more as a reporter or as a chronicler. To the extent that I am a critic, especially from here on out, I kind of am following Auden's great edict that the job of the critic is to praise. I mean, I really tend to think that it is such a scary, miserable, horrible thing to be a creative person, and people, they cut their veins and bleed onto the paper and or onto the canvas, and it's agonizing and so forth, and then critics come along and there's too little there's not enough time, and I hope that for most of the rest of my life I will confine myself to praise, to songs of praise. Having said that, there are people who are critics for newspapers, and their job is to do the other thing, and it's not a bad job, it's not an evil job, but it's just one that there's just so much incredible stuff going on in the world that it seems to me that that's what one should do at this point.
Okay, thank you. I feel as though we need to have time to buy books and talk to Lawrence and get him to sign our books at the back. So unless anyone has really something urgent, I think we should...
Or if they have something urgent, that's where I'll be
come
back
and
there.
talk to him at the back. So thank you so much, Lawrence, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.